Hey guys, welcome to AP Biology or College Biology. We're going to be focusing in on Unit 5, which is all about heredity. Please note that we're focusing in on section 5.1, which is all about meiosis. Before we get started, please note the disclaimer listed below. Okay, so before we get started talking about meiosis, I want you to understand that for any sort of AP biology exam or college biology test, oftentimes you're led to compare and contrast meiosis to mitosis. So I just want to preface that before we get started. So oftentimes when we are reviewing this, we're comparing this to mitosis. With that being said, just as an additional disclaimer, if you don't know anything about mitosis or you need a little review, make sure to check out our podcast or playlist related to Unit 4, where you can find a very conducive video related to mitosis and then come back here if you feel like you need the review. Okay, now that I have that out of the way, let's get started with our meiosis review. So, meiosis is the mechanism by organisms to generate gametes with cells. So, previously, we talked about mitosis, and mitosis was about producing two cells that came from one cell. And while that is true, that is for, at least for humans, every single cell in your body minus the sex cells. Okay. So I just want to notice that when you're saying that, when we're talking about mitosis, see, this is where we're comparing mitosis to meiosis. In the previous videos, we're talking about the division of somatic cells. Now, you might be thinking, what are somatic cells? Every cell in your body is considered a somatic cell minus your sex cells, which include the egg and the sperm. So if we're talking about the egg and the sperm, we are talking about the process of meiosis. Everything else in your body is going to go through mitosis. And that's a key aspect that you need to remember when we're talking about these two, because you could get a FRQ or a multiple choice question where you need to convey or understand that. So, for example, eye cells, nose cells, mouth cells, hair cells, the skin cells that you have, all of those types of cells are going to essentially undergo mitosis. And because of this, we call them somatic cells. So that's important to note. Somatic cells are all the cells in our body with the exception of gametes. And when we refer to gametes, remember we're talking about those sex cells that undergo meiosis. So the primary goal of meiosis, by the way, is to create some sort of genetic diversity. Now, we're going to talk about that more in a later video, but for now, you need to understand when we talked about mitosis, not meiosis, but previously mitosis. Remember, we had a parent cell split into two daughter cells, and they were going to be exactly the same as the parent cell. So, for example, let's say that you get a scab on your finger. Now, we know that that scab bleeds, and what ends up happening is you need to close up that scar. So, what ends up happening is that cells are going to replicate, and exactly the same cells are going to develop from that parent cell. And because of this, that undergoes what we call mitosis. We want the same exact daughter cells from that parent cell. So it produces two daughter cells that are exactly the same. And for meiosis, which is what this video is referring to, what ends up happening is you go through what's called meiosis I and meiosis II. And it's a splitting process where you have what are called chromosomes that end up undergoing this splitting process and we're going to talk about what's called crossing over and non-disjunction in a later video. But for now, what you need to understand are the two phases of meiosis. Meiosis I and Meiosis II allow for that genetic diversity. Okay, so they allow for that process to occur. Now, when we're talking about meiosis, remember we're comparing it to mitosis. Remember, mitosis undergoes prophase, then you had metaphase, like you had this step where it's undergoing prophase, and then you had metaphase where it lines up at the metaphase plate. By it, I mean chromosomes. And then just as a reminder, we had the anaphase where those chromosomes end up splitting. And then eventually you have the splitting into telophase, and eventually you get cytokinesis, which allows for those two daughter cells to prepare. Now, meiosis is a tad bit different, where we're going to talk about that in the next slide, but there are two breakdowns here. And meiosis I is very similar to mitosis. And this is going to be the first round, which includes the DNA replication of the chromosomes. They're going to basically divide. And then what ends up happening is you have two rounds of cellular division that exist. So you have one and then two. We call this round one and round two. And what's going to happen is the daughter cells, so essentially you'll get four daughter cells. They are very similar to the original parent cell, but not exactly the same. And you can see in the picture here, they look very different. What ends up happening essentially is we see that the daughter cells are halved. So when we're talking about the daughter cells half, not half, we're talking about the chromosome numbers itself. So, for example, if I'm talking about mitosis, we use this term 2N, which basically means that in every cell you have two copies of a DNA, or two copies, I shouldn't say two copies of DNA. You have two copies which make a set of chromosomes. So, one from your mother and another one from your father, essentially. And what ends up happening is, remember, it has to be exactly the same. So, what ends up happening is for humans, for example, we have 46 chromosomes in every cell, minus gametes, which remember are those egg and sperm cells. But for the somatic cells, all of them will have 46 chromosomes in normal cells. And this is important because what ends up happening is once you complete, for example, mitosis, the 46 chromosomes still remain. So what ends up happening is you still have what's called 2N, 2N, 2N. And you might be thinking, what is 2N? 2N equals, we say 46, okay? Because we have 46 chromosomes. But remember, we have two in a pair. So essentially, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, half a set, or 23 pairs, I should say, 46 total. And remember, in each pair, one is from your father and another one is from your mother. So essentially, that's where the 46 chromosomes come from. And in normal mitosis, you're constantly producing that 46. Now, remember, I said there is an exception, right? We also want to remember that anytime I'm talking about 2N, I'm talking about diploid. Di means two. So mitosis essentially will produce the diploid number of chromosomes before and after. Now let's circle back to meiosis, which is what this video is about, right? So what we're talking about meiosis, remember, we're talking about creating those gametes, the egg and the sperm, right? And all of those will have to undergo meiosis. Now, for meiosis, what ends up happening is you start off with 2N, and in those eggs or in the sperm, they're both cells. What ends up happening is you undergo meiosis I, which, by the way, is very similar to mitosis in general, but we'll cover that in just a second. And essentially, what will happen is you have 2N, which is your diploid number, which will produce 2N. It just will undergo what's called crossing over and independent assortment. which we'll cover in a later video. And essentially what will happen is from that 2N, you will undergo what's called meiosis II, which takes the 2N into an N because you are dividing again. So the process of dividing twice essentially produces half the chromosome number. So that means is we're going from diploid to half or haploid. So diploid is what we're starting off in meiosis, but we end up with haploid at the end of meiosis. And that's what produces the egg and the sperm. So essentially, after fertilization, fertilization means the joining of the egg and sperm. What ends up happening is those haploids end up conjoining together to make those diploid cells, which are essentially you and me. So what happens is we all have a set of gametes in our own body, and they have 23 chromosomes. Once they're fertilized, they end up becoming 46. So that's the point of haploid versus diploid cells. Now let's take a look at the steps in meiosis, specifically meiosis I, and then we're going to go into meiosis II. Now, when we're talking about meiosis, this is more detailed picture, but first we're going to talk about prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase I, which are all parts of meiosis I. Then what ends up happening is you have meiosis II. Meiosis II consists of also prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, but those are designated as two. So in meiosis II, you have the same steps essentially that they're called, but they're just designated with a different number. So now let's talk about meiosis I in more detail. When we're talking about meiosis I in general, it's very similar to mitosis. In a sense, when you see prophase, what ends up happening is the same thing that happened in mitosis. You have that nuclear envelope dissipate, and then what ends up happening is planning for crossing over, or crossing over occurs in that step, and crossing over is unique to meiosis. Now, if you see here, ends up happening is you see the color of the chromosomes here. So let's say that you have one chromosome and you have another chromosome and they're a pair. What ends up happening is the pair will end up taking these two parts right here and flipping it. So I think this is best drawn if I draw it with a different color. So let's say that I have a chromosome like, oop, let me just change that color there. Chromosomes pair, and they look something like this. Remember, there's one from the mother and one from the father, essentially, right? And that's what we mean by the pair. So in this cell, we have one from each parent. But in that first step of prophase, which this is the part that's unique to meiosis, that is not unique to mitosis. This does not occur in mitosis. What ends up happening is you have the chromosome, and the chromosome will start flipping apart. So you could see this blue chromosome here. What ends up happening is it will end up creating or removing the blue part and replacing it with the green part from that green chromosome. And vice versa, the blue part that was removed from the original blue chromosome will end up going to the other chromosome that was once fully green. So they have a little bit of both. And the purpose of this is to increase genetic diversity. Essentially, you don't look exactly the same as your parent. And we don't want that to happen. We want diversity to exist when it comes to how we look compared to our parents. And that's why crossing over occurs to increase the genetic diversity. Now, after that occurs, what ends up happening is you have my metaphase one. And metaphase one is going to be when those homologous chromosomes will now line up at the equator or in the center. During anaphase, which is the third step, you will have those chromosomes split. And then telophase or cytokinesis included is going to be the part where the chromosomes are going to gather at the poles and then the cytoplasm divides and you have that cleavage furrow. Now, essentially, what has happened by the time you get to prophase two, which is the step of meiosis, remember we halved the chromosomes. So we now went from 2N in meiosis I to now N. And what I mean by N is actually you have two separate ends. So in prophase two, you have two eggs that have now been produced, each with half the chromosomes. And remember, they went through crossing over, so it's a mosh pit of different combinations, right? So what ends up happening during that portion of prophase, once again, you go through metaphase, but this is metaphase two, where you have the now mixed up chromosomes lining up at the metaphase plate. Remember, it's half the chromosomes. We're no longer at pairs. So the chromosomes are now going to split during anaphase and they're going to push apart to opposite poles. And then while you have telophase and cytokinesis, the second version, essentially you'll end up having four daughter cells or four cells that are produced from that one cell. So now it's quiz time. Let's take a look at the following question and see if you could potentially come up with an answer. Take a moment and pause this video and then take a moment to try to attempt to answer the question. Once completed, make sure to unpause the video. Okay, so now that you're done reviewing the question, let's see if you got the correct answer. So the question firstly states a cell in a certain species undergoes meiosis, starting with 64 chromosomes in its diploid state. After meiosis is complete, how many chromosomes will each gamete have? Well, first of all, they let you know that they're talking about gametes. Remember, gametes are not somatic cells, which means that they're going to have haploid, right? Because we have haploid in gametes. So, which means that because there's 64 chromosomes in the diploid state, they're going to have half the chromosomes in that haploid state since we're talking about gametes. So the correct answer in this case would be B, 32, because we take 64 divided by 2 gives you 32. So there's 32 chromosomes in the gametes. Now, if this question was flipped and they talked about somatic cells, in this case, then the scenario would be different, and the correct answer for that scenario would be A. I just want to point that out because you could get a potential question like this or an FRQ question related to something where you have to differentiate between the number of chromosomes that are indicated in gamete cells and somatic cells. If you have any questions, make sure to put more information into understanding this video because I think understanding this video comes along with also understanding Unit 4. So I just want to preface that out and put that out there. Also, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this one. Check out our earlier podcasts. We have Units 1 through 4 ready to go. And also make sure to hit that like button for more videos like this to keep your studying going. Thank you so much. Hey, Geeking Out on STEM family, guess what? We want you to hit that subscribe button. Why? Because we'll be producing more content just like this for the AP Biology exam and the new digital SAT exam. By subscribing, you'll be getting exclusive, up-to-date tips, tricks, and secrets for both exams. Also, if you're a parent, a teacher, a homeschool instructor, or a student, you might be looking for affordable and exclusive digital products to help improve multiple choice questions, free response questions, or question bank questions related to both the digital SAT or AP Biology exam. We have them here. Make sure to check out our link tree in our bio for curated resources that you won't find anywhere else. These unique resources are designed to help you raise your score. By hitting the subscribe button, the more subscribers we get, by the way, the more videos we can make. So make sure to join our family to ensure that you get a perfect score for both exams.